Hello and welcome back. We're ready to continue our project on this simple set of flat jaw tongs. We've already drawn out the reins. Our next step will be to cut the pieces apart, and then we'll finish shaping the jaw and assemble and adjust the tongs. Thanks for coming back.
What we have here are two relatively identical tong halves, although there is a problem. The reins are pretty much the same length. You know, if one's a hair longer, it just really doesn't matter. The main thing is you want them to grip about the same. But at some point on this second one, I took too much of a bite at the edge of the anvil and drew out a little bit too much in this area, so my boss is a little bit thinner here. Not going to hurt anything, it just means that for them to match, I need to take a bigger bite here, and then I'll have to cut this jaw off a little bit later so the jaws are the same length. Not really a big deal. It's just something that happened, and you can adapt and you can fix that, or you can start fresh and make one that matches this and one that matches that and end up with two pairs of tongs. Either way is that at this notch, we'll use the one that's the smaller one here, we are going to, or at that mark, we're going to create a notch that comes in about this far. And we don't want too big a notch here. We don't want a big 1/2 or 5/8 notch because it'll make things weak. But we're going to notch that, and that leaves this easy to twist. And we're going to twist this 90 degrees, and that will give us our jaw. The problem with this is that it's a little bit weak, and it's not the strongest pair of tongs in the world, but these were never meant to be that heavy duty anyways, and it's a good way to get an introduction to tong making, and you can make a lot of different tongs using this technique as long as you know that this is kind of the weak point right there where you make this twist. So how do we create the notch? You could saw it in, just make sure there's no sharp corners. If you saw it, stop short and then file with a chainsaw file or something to make this round. If you have a skinny fuller, a tool like that, you could fuller in. But we're assuming you don't have a lot of tools, and a bottom fuller would be the ideal. That's the way I would usually go with this. But let's see if we can create a quick bottom fuller that doesn't require any real effort just to do the notch on this pair of tongs. What I came up with, it's just a piece of 1/4 by 3/4 flat bar that was out in my scrap heap. I ground, or you can file a round surface on there so you don't leave any nicks as we drive this bar down over the top of it. Piece of cake. Only problem is it's tippy, so I'm going to put a pair of vice grips on there so it doesn't tip. You could bend this to drop it down in your hardy hole, and that would be better and a more permanent tool. But I figure this is a one pair of tongs little fuller, and if you're going to make more, take the time to make a better tool. But if you don't have a bunch of tools, you can make quickie makeshift tools like this that will get the job done. I just want to drive this down over this bar, not too far, a little over halfway probably is about right. Now this, I don't know if you can see that, you start to mushroom out, you're upsetting that edge. And that upset is okay if it's down in the middle, but I don't want it right at the edge. I want it down here where I need the strength. So I'm going to rock this side to side a little bit, try and keep that upset going where I want it. But that's about as far as I want to notch that. And then we're going to twist this. And we're going to do that to both of them. Now remember, this one was a little bit off when I didn't, because I was overzealous on that other bar. I need to make this one a hair smaller. So I'm going to adapt for that now. And when I'm doing this, I'm not trying to thin that back to 1/4 inch. I don't want it at 1/4 inch. I want it to be thicker. I just want to make sure the rough edges are knocked down and it's smooth. And I want these to be about the same depth. We're going to work some more on these afterwards anyway, so it's not super critical. Before we go any further, let's stop to think about this a little bit. We're going to put a quarter turn in the jaw so that it's perpendicular or 90 degrees to the boss. But it matters which way you turn it. You're going to want to do both the same. A pair of flat jaw tongs, both halves are exactly identical. They are not mirror images, which is what you might think in your brain, but they are not. They're identical. When you start getting into some different kinds of tongs, sometimes that's not true anymore. But for the simpler tongs and V-bit tongs and things like that, both halves are exactly the same, and when you bring them together, they work in opposition because you turn one over. So which way do we turn this? Does it matter? And yes, it does. Tongs can be left-handed or right-handed. I am a right-handed smith. I hold my tongs in my left hand. I want left-handed tongs. Now, I've heard people say that the opposite, this is a right-handed pair of tongs because you're a right-handed person. But it's easier for me to think about it is this pair of tongs goes in my left hand. And if you have old tongs or store-bought tongs, chances are they are made for the right-handed smith, so they are made to go in your left hand, and I would call that a left-handed pair of tongs. Why does that matter? It's because the reins on old tongs and on most blacksmith-made tongs aren't one on top of the other like a pair of pliers would be, or like some of the new tongs. Some of the new tongs have taken care of this, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But when you put this in your hand, because the upper rein is towards your thumb, it wants to lay in your hand nicely. In my right hand, it wants to fall away from my hand, and that's not as good. That's not a natural thing. This is more natural, and you just squeeze it, and you've got a nice grip. So this works much better, and try to keep your tongs handed appropriately. If you're left-handed smith and you hammer with your left hand, make tongs to fit your right hand. They would be the opposite of what I'm making. So the tong, this upper jaw is away from my thumb, and the upper rein, because they're on opposite sides, is towards my thumb, and that makes it want to lay in my hand more naturally. I hope that it's hard to see, I think. But I think that's an important thing to remember. If you get them backwards, they're going to be more awkward to use. So that means if we were to put this in the vise with the notch facing down, we would turn this jaw counterclockwise. Now, if you don't have a vise, and we're assuming you have minimal tools for this project, and this is a very rough way of doing things, and sometimes, I've already used vice grips for this, and I've already used this pair of pliers, so I'm going to hope you've got some substitute that will serve this purpose. 2 crescent wrenches would do it, but a vise and a twisting wrench would be ideal. So, we're going to use these, though, just in case you don't have a vise and a twisting wrench, and I'm going to keep this pair of tongs handy to use as a reference in case I get it wrong. The vise is definitely the way to go with this. This is very makeshift, and not really the way I like to work. But I know that not everybody's got all the tools, so we're just going to put a twist in that. 90 degrees, or a little bit more, because during the next process it'll want to untwist. So a little more than 90 is okay, but we can come back and retwist that. So that's what we're after for now. We can do that with both of these. Now, if you've done everything correctly, when you lay these together, they should look kind of like a pair of tongs. There's some refinement to be done, but you can see what we're after. You can also see that the top rein is towards my left hand, so we've got a left-handed pair of tongs for a right-handed blacksmith. So now we just need to refine the jaw and the boss area and try to make both of these look pretty much alike. So we want to do some half-face blows and try to get that jaw to line up. And we want to thin it out some, because this is way wider. So, or make it narrower, I should say. We actually let it thicken up and become a thicker material. So we work the jaw here. When we want to work the boss, we go to the opposite side of the anvil. And we can kind of clean that all up. And try to keep it from twisting, because this wants to twist. And there will always be some sign that this was originally made from a twisted bar. You're never going to completely get rid of that. And that's okay. It's honest sign of the process. It's not my preference for a pair of tongs, like I said. I think this is a little bit weaker. But that's what we're after. And I'm going to work on that boss and round it up just a little bit. So I want to work that all the way over the anvil and just work the corners down a little bit. You can also do that on the near side. You have to scrunch down a little bit. Just depends on your preference. And the exact shape of the jaw depends on your personal preference and what you're going to do. You can take this same design and make lots of different styles of tongs. We're just doing flat jaw tongs, but you could find a way to adapt this by using different size material for one jaw to do box jaws. It'd be easy to make V-bit tongs like this, or round nose tongs. So it's a versatile way of doing things. So we want to make the second one look just like the first one. By the way, this series of steps is a more traditional way of making tongs typically. When you start with a larger bar and you offset at the near end of the anvil for the jaw, bring it to the far end, roll it towards your tong hand and kick it off 45 degrees, forge the boss, and then roll it towards your tong hand a second time to forge the other end of the boss and start the reins. And we will cover that in much more detail in a future tong making video. I'll probably end up filing this boss to adapt and get them both the same size. A little bit extra work. Wouldn't have to do it if I was paying more attention earlier, but that's just the way it goes. You want to get the inside of the boss as smooth as you can, because that's a working area of the tong, and these things have to be able to work back and forth. But you can see we're pretty much there. I'm going to go ahead and put holes in these. And I'll probably do a little filing to clean some of this up, although it doesn't look too bad. And we'll have to trim off that jaw that ended up a little bit too long. There's an age-old question of should you punch the hole or should you drill the hole? Really, I don't think it matters. I think you'll find that blacksmiths are split pretty close to 50-50. The argument for punching the hole is that you will remove less material than you will drilling. It's going to push some material out to the side and give you a stronger boss in theory. This pair of tongs, the weak point is right here where we did the twist, so that's not a big deal. The argument for drilling the hole is that it will be exact and you will have a smoother operating pair of tongs and they shouldn't get loose and floppy quite as easily. I don't think it makes that much difference. You can split the difference, punch the hole a hair undersized, then run a drill bit through there to clean it up. and you get the best of both worlds. I don't know that you really need to do that, although if your punch isn't quite exactly the right size, you might have to do that just so you can make a rivet fit. So I'm going to go ahead and punch the holes because we're doing this as simply as we can, and we're assuming you don't have a lot of tools like a drill press, but that you could make a punch if you needed to. So we're going to punch. And think about this a little bit. It's easy to start the punch here with the tongs right up in the middle of the anvil. At some point we have to roll that over to punch the slug out, and we usually do that over the pritchel hole. If this is supported up in the air at that point, this isn't going to work very well. So the thing to do is to start out here off the edge of the anvil where you can keep the boss flat, and then roll that jaw up in the air when you come over the pritchel hole. It's normal when I'm punching. I've got a can of water to cool the punch in. Try to get this centered. Measure it and make a mark if you need to. There's I should say I got a can of ice there. You don't want to drive the punch too far through in this situation because it's a tapered punch and I'll end up making this hole too big. But I want to drive that over the pritchel hole. And there's my hole. I've deformed things just a little bit. If I've got heat, I'll straighten it. If I don't have the heat, I'll go get it hot again first. That's really all you're after right there. And you want to do that on both sides. That's why it's important to get it centered so your tongs fit the same. So there's my other hole. Clean that up a little bit. There's one other thing I want to do with this before we start worrying about assembling these. And that is, I would like to be able to hold square bar or round bar lengthwise in these if possible. The pair of tongs we've been using as an example has a little notch down the middle, or a groove, and that will hold pretty well a pair of 3/8 or a piece of 3/8 square bar or 3/8 round bar. It's not the greatest in the world sometimes, but that's really pretty solid. It will also hold flat 1/4 inch flat bar. So this is really pretty useful, and to some extent I'll bet we can even hold 1/4 inch square bar. Not as solid as the 3/8 square bar, but you could get away with that to some extent. So that groove down the middle is pretty handy. That does require a tool we haven't discussed. A cold chisel is ideal for that to start it, but then you can finish it off with a piece of square bar. So line this up centered because this is going to have to match on both sides later, and you'll refine this once you've assembled the tongs. Really all you're doing is creating a nice line to be able to follow later with a piece of 3/8 square bar. So that's really all you need to do with the chisel. Now if you don't have a cold chisel you can do this with, you can set that on the anvil. This is some place where having somebody to swing a sledgehammer might come in handy. And line a piece of square bar up centered on the diamond and just drive that down in there. And you can create that little groove. This isn't as reliable to start with. It's a good way to finish even if you start with a cold chisel. But it's a little harder to get this in, and you do end up flattening off the square bar. It ends up with a bunch of funny little bevels on it. You might have to change your angle some, or go to a different corner, or swap ends. If you swap ends, pull the first end off before you grab it with the other hand. But that does make a pretty nice little groove, and that's going to help us hold some other size bar in this pair of tongs. So I want to let this air cool, and then we'll address the assembly process and any adjustments in the the boss there if it needs it. It may not need it. Well, I put our tongs together temporarily with a bolt. And you can see they're kind of funky and kind of off-centered. So we're going to clean this up a little bit. If you watch the way the boss runs, as these close, they force each other apart. And that's because this jaw is rubbing a little bit here. So I'm going to take a file and clean that up before I try to rivet this, or it's going to create a problem in the long run. And then we'll straighten all this after it's riveted. Doesn't take much cleaning up. You really do need a vise to file effectively. Trying to hold this at the anvil, you could do this eventually, and you could use a powered grinder to do some of this if you need to. But if you don't have anything and you still need the tongs, go ahead and try and clean this up hot at the anvil. Do the assembly work, and then work it a little bit more and make the parts kind of fit each other hot after it's assembled, and they'll work okay. They won't work as smoothly. They may be a little loose and floppy, but it will work. Then put it back together with the bolt. Now, one of the first pairs of tongs I ever made, I think I put together with a bolt temporarily because I didn't have whatever I thought I needed for a rivet. I think that pair of tongs had a bolt in it forever. So that's a lot better. It still snugs up just a little bit as it comes together, but not bad. So I think we're ready to put a rivet in there. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to trim this end off here, because one end is longer than the other. We could grind that off, cut it with a saw or whatever. But I think a hacksaw is just fine. My original plan for this pair of tongs was to put in a 1/4 inch rivet, but because of the tapered punch, I ended up overdriving it a little bit, and my hole was too big, and the 1/4 inch rivet was just going to be too loose, and that causes too many problems in setting. So I went ahead and drilled this. You could just drive the tapered punch in a little bit further to enlarge the hole. And this is now going to fit a 5/16 rivet, which is a stronger rivet, but this pair of tongs really doesn't need the stronger rivet. Okay, so I've got those down tight. Things are still pretty wonky here, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I want to get this rivet set. And this rivet, this 5/16 rivet, is a little bit too long. I really want about 1.5 times the diameter. Right now I got 3/4 of an inch sticking out. What I would really like is more like 1/2 inch or so. Whatever 1.5 times the diameter of 5/16 is. I guess that would be 15/32, but I'm probably not going to think of it that far. That's pretty close to 1/2. So I'm going to go by setting the unheaded part of the rivet down in the fire. I can just use the tongs as a handle to heat that up. I don't have to mess with a hot rivet as it comes out of the fire and try and line it up. Not uncommon for the rivet on one side of a pair of tongs to not quite match the other side, especially when you're using a commercial rivet and don't have a heading tool for the other side. That's really all you need to do, though. That's never coming apart. But boy, are these ugly, and they don't even open. So we got work to do still. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to heat this up and try and just get it to open a little bit. But by heating this joint, we'll expand the rivet. and we allow the hot material to kind of adapt to itself, and we should be able to get these to open up, and then we can start making our adjustments. This is someplace a chisel actually comes in quite handy because it'll get down inside this jaw here. Now I can get my hands on there and we can work this. And it's not at all uncommon to have to work a pair of tongs hot to get them to work. They almost never work when you rivet them. Just very minor adjustments at this point. All I'm doing is trying to smooth out the action so that we can actually work with these a little bit. Now you can probably make a pair of tongs without a vise, but for some of these little misalignments like this, trying to get things back in line so they work smoothly and things fit in your hand nicely. Don't grab too far up, that's hot. One of the reasons I like these hot mill gloves. So that's pretty good there. The next thing we need to do is adjust the jaws. We need to fix our square slot in there so it holds the size bar we want, and set it to a size of flat bar. The first thing I want to do here is I'm going to put this 3/8 square bar in that we were using earlier and work the jaws down parallel. You're not trying to fold them over this. If you were making V-bit tongs, they'd fold around, but I'm making flat jaw tongs with a V-notch, so it's a little bit different. Keep everything lined up, and make sure that the back of the reins doesn't come together and touch, because if you do, this is what's taking all your squeeze, and this may not come tight. So at this point, this still needs to be open so you can squeeze on this. And while this is red hot, it's real easy to close these up too far. In case you haven't figured it out, forging the basic tong shape is the easy part. Doing all this adjustment and tweaking is the hard part. But this is what makes the tongs either work or not work. Let's go back to the vise real quick and make sure everything is straight and lined up. Now I was really hoping to make this pair of tongs without the use of the vise, to keep the tooling as simple as possible. But the reality is that this makes life so much easier. Now these tongs are a little bit twisted, so I actually want to put a little more twist in them this way, and there. Okay. Now that's 90 degrees, and that's a much better fit. So we've got a functional pair of tongs. I've done a fair amount of tweaking and fussing like you were watching there, and done a little bit more cleanup with a file just to make sure that they're what I like. But they are completely functional, even if they were a little fiddly there at the end. So the last thing I'm going to do is heat these up and wire brush them real good. And this is just to make them look prettier. This doesn't serve any real purpose in the long run as far as the function of the tongs goes. So the little bit of paste wax on these gets down in the joint. That'll help lubricate the joint. Your tongs will run smoother, last longer. It also helps prevent rust. Wipe off the excess wax. Let them finish cooling, and we'll take a look and see what we got. Well, there is a successful pair of tongs made without using another pair of tongs anywhere in the process. So it is possible to do it. This was fairly light material, fairly light pair of tongs. but they are a completely functional pair of tongs for light duty tongs. They are fairly traditional in their appearance, and that twist makes them easy to get the shape, but it caused us some problems at the end. It wants to continually untwist back to where it was before, because that's the path of least resistance for that material. There's a little tension built up in that twist. So the jaws keep wanting to untwist while you're working them, and that's part of why they were so fiddly there at the end. But that's not uncommon. The actual forging, the basic shape of the tongs, is really the easy part. It's getting everything to fit so that they actually hold material that matters. That's a good hold. That's not going anywhere. Of course, if I do that too hard, I'm liable to throw that at the camera, and I don't want to do that. And it'll hold a piece of square bar, and depending on how you size them is what size material they will hold. But because that's a V-notch, it will also hold a round bar nicely. So it's a very functional pair of tongs. So here's what they look like close up. And you can still see a telltale sign of that twist in there. That never completely goes away. And if you work too hard to get rid of it, you actually end up making them kind of thin. These are, again, tongs made to hold in your left hand because they want to fall over towards your left thumb. The upper rein is the one close to your left thumb. If the upper rein was on the right side, they would be right-handed tongs, which would be for a left-handed blacksmith. I hope that makes sense. But you can see the way they fit. You can see the way that fits there. And you could put another chisel cut or notch in this way so it holds material sideways. I just don't find that real necessary because I have other tongs that I would hold this material in sideways. But if it's the only pair you've got for holding this little quarter round bar while you make hooks out of it, by all means put another little notch in right there at the end, and it'll hold that nice and secure, because this doesn't hold that very well. But it holds a nice variety of things. That's a good pair of tongs. They're light, they're kind of short, they'll be real comfortable, they're not going to wear you out using them all day long. So I think you'll like them. I think you ought to go make a few pair. A pair of tongs like this is a good introduction to tong making. This is not the greatest tongs. Flat jaw tongs really are the least useful. They're very versatile. They will do a lot of things poorly, but they are not as good at holding stock as box jaw tongs or V-bit tongs in general, or bolt tongs and a lot of the others. But they're a great way to understand the mechanics of tongs, understand how the boss and the jaw and the reins all relate, and give you some practice, and you will use them. I use little tongs like this almost daily in the shop, even though they're not the ones I use for heavy forging. So I definitely think they're worth doing. I think it's worth making several pair, make them to hold a few different sizes of material, but generally small. By the time you get over 3/8 thick, that's probably the limit of a small pair of tongs like this. That weak spot from the twist is going to be problematic if you're really squeezing hard on these things. But if you want to make this style of tongs bigger, go to a 5/16 by 1 or a 3/8 by 1 or 3/8 by 1 1/4, and you can make bigger tongs using that same quarter twist technique. And it's all the same, but there'll be a lot more drawing out of the reins. You could even make a really light pair out of 1/4 by 3/4, but I'm not sure what use they would be other than just picking up little small parts off the floor so you don't have to bend over. But anyways, make several. I've got a few. They all look about the same, but they're not identical because they're unique and they're handmade. The same idea can be used to make pickup tongs, chain maker's tongs. If you start with a wider piece of material, you could widen it out to make box jaw tongs. You can do V-bit tongs, and we may do some more like this using the same technique to make a variety of tongs, but we will also explore more traditional methods. This is very similar. It's a little heavier, a little bit longer. This is made from a single piece of 5/8 square bar, and it's drawn out before from a long bar so you can hold on to it, so you don't need tongs to make it, and then turned around, and then the jaw is formed, pretty much like we did this, but it's a traditional forging pattern, as opposed to the quarter twist. And this will be the next kind of tong we make. They'll also be done probably as flat jaw tongs. We probably won't spend as much time talking about tongs and tong philosophy and theory and all that, and we'll just get down to forging these. But we'll make a pair of these, and maybe make a pair that are a box jaw set as well. After that, we'll do the forge welded. So if you're doing even heavier, this makes more sense because you make the jaw and you only do this much of the rein, and then you forge weld it to a handle, and you can then finish this off the way you want it. And that's a good way if you don't have a power hammer. If you have a power hammer, really drawing out the reins is probably the strongest way to do it. Eliminates the weld and makes a nice pair of tongs. But without a power hammer, forge welding is a good idea. And this will be part of our tong making and for our forge welding discussions, so we can kill two birds with one stone, and that'll probably be our third version of tongs. And after that, we'll do others. We'll do bolt tongs and chain tongs and pickup tongs, and there's lots of different tong options. I probably have a half dozen specific requests for videos on specific sets of tongs, and I will try to cover all of those in the next few months. But we also need to get back to our window grill project. So we'll jump around a little bit. Hopefully this doesn't bore anybody that way, because we're not doing the same topic day after day after day. But maybe we'll pick up each topic once a week, and we'll continue on with our little short videos, because I think those have a certain validity to do that little 3 or 4 minute clip that people don't have to invest a lot of time to watch. And I don't have to invest a lot of time to shoot them, so that's not bad. Anyways, get out to the shop, make yourself 3 or 4 sets of nice little flat jaw tongs, get some practice at it, have fun doing it, do the best job you can, but don't get too worked up if they aren't gorgeous, because my first half dozen pairs of tongs were really quite ugly, and that's okay. They still did the job they needed to do at the time, even though I don't have them anymore because I wasn't that happy. But if you do a good job, you'll be proud of them, you'll keep them for years. I'd appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up. Love it if you hit the subscribe button. But in one way or the other, we'll see you for the next one.